with a one-act play and published them in a pamphlet titled Scottsboro Limited. I am more excited about this Scottsboro book, Hughes wrote, than anything I've ever published. He read his poetry in Montgomery, Tuskegee, Birmingham, and here at Oakwood College. Hughes' experience in Alabama is an example of the many intersections of communism and the Scottsboro Boys case in Jim Crow, Alabama. Shortly after his visit, Hughes left for the Soviet Union with 21 other African Americans to participate in a propaganda film about race and labor relations in the American South. The film was never made, but Hughes stayed on for several months writing for a Russian language newspaper. In the Soviet Union, he couldn't get enough copies of Scottsboro Limited to replenish the ones he was selling. He literally sold tens of thousands of his Scottsboro poems in his one-act play. Before moving on, I want to look at this poem one more time. You can't, unfortunately, the way this poem is typed out here. The first line in it, 8 black boys in a southern jail, is all caps, the way Langston Hughes wrote it. And to me, I think what he's doing there is he's recreating a headline, because they're in the headlines all over the world by this time. They were in headlines all over the world within a month after their arrest. But what I think what Hughes is saying is this should be the headline that people are looking at here. The 8 black boys refers to the 9 Scottsboro Boys. During the appeal process at the Alabama appeal level, the youngest one, Eugene Williams, was the Alabama court ruled that he should have been tried in juvenile court. He was 13 at the time of the arrest. Rather than releasing him, though, which was what the law required at the time, they sent him to Jefferson County Jail in Birmingham. So he wasn't at Kilby on death row. The other ones are on death row in Kilby. The white lie obviously refers to Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, the 2 women from Huntsville, the 2 mill workers who accused these 9 young African Americans of raping them. And the last thing is the word they. Okay, so he talks about these immortal feet, and he talks about you know, when they come, and in what the Communist Party believed and what Langston Hughes is writing about here is the idea that these people on death row are political prisoners. They're not just convicts, they're not just defendants in a case, but they're actually political prisoners. And I didn't print the rest of the poem, but he does mention, he has a list of other past and present political prisoners. People like Gandhi, Jesus Christ is on the list, Moses, John Brown. He mentions Vladimir Lenin, so that was sort of a tell. But he also mentions, I'm sorry, there's a thing here, I don't know what that is.
Maybe just click anywhere else there.
Thank you. He also mentions Nat Turner. Now, in this group here, I think we have a lot of educated, historically minded people. Many of you will know Nat Turner. He was the one who led the slave rebellion in 1831 in Virginia. Still the largest, or the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. So he's on that list. That happened in 1831. The arrest happened in 1931. So it was a centenary. It was a 100-year anniversary of that. And throughout the communist literature and communist newspapers, and all left-wing newspapers as well, there was a notion of there was a call to do a Nat Turner style rebellion in the South, in Alabama. So the stakes are high, the tensions are high. The world is changing. It's 1930. 1931, this is 1932, but what do I have to do here? Did not think that.
Might be reading on the mouse.
Okay. These are the Scottsboro, the 9 defendants. This photograph was taken by an AP photographer the morning after their arrests. Many of you are familiar with the story, and due to the nature of this talk, I'm going to kind of move quickly over some of the legal aspects of this case. But the facts were this: these 9, ages 13 to 20, Charlie Williams was 20, Eugene Williams was 13, were hoboing, leaving from Chattanooga. They hoboed on a Southern freight train. They testified that they were headed toward Memphis in order to find work. There's no reason not to believe that. That would have been reasonable. When they, as the train started moving at some point between Chattanooga and Stevenson, a couple of them, we know Clarence Norris, we know Haywood Patterson were involved in this, ran across a group of white guys who were a little bit older, also hoboing, and a fight broke out aboard the train over seating, over space. So the trains had 2 types of cars. One would be a box car, which you see more frequently. The other is a gondola style car, which is an open top. And you'll see those go by too, often carrying coal and such. This was carrying, their train was carrying a coal-like substance. So, and everybody, it seems like, wanted to get on this gondola car. I don't know if it's like riding in a convertible, no top. But it was cold. It was 50 degrees. It was sunny. But you're moving 35 miles an hour on a train, so you're going to feel some cold. The black group, the African American group, bested the white group, who were either thrown or jumped off the train, depending on which story you believe. And the whites went over to the depot in Stevenson, reported the incident, and then said, oh, by the way, there's 2 women on board, 2 white women on board. That set off all sorts of bells and whistles, okay? So by the time the railroad agent started calling down the line, he called Scottsboro first, but the train had passed. So then he called down to Payrock, where the train was stopping anyway. They pulled the 9 off the train. Then they pulled the 2 women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, and took them back to Scottsboro, where they were arrested, and they were charged with rape and assault. They each had faced two charges. That was March 25th. That night there was a mob that gathered around the courthouse. Famously, at one point in the evening, Sheriff Juan came out with his shotgun and said the first person that tries to cross here is going to get their head blown off. And that backed the crowd off at least long enough before the National Guard got there, some 4 hours after the call was made. This is the morning after all that activity. The defendants then did not stay in Scottsboro. They were taken to Etowah County Jail in Gladstone. So and here's where I've got to synthesize, unless you guys wanted to bring your sleeping bags, because the story gets really long. The trials lasted from April 6th through April 9th. And most of the trials were really through April 8th. They tried 9 people, okay? Again, I want to do this timeline one more time. They're arrested on March 25th. 2 weeks later, the trial starts, and they try in 4 groups, okay? Trying to be strategic in some way. the group of 9 who we call the Scottsboro Boys met their attorney 3 hours before the trial started. 3 hours before they started. So it obviously didn't give them a lot of time to prepare anything. As we discuss, we're going to move on now, as we discuss these complexities of this case, I want to make 2 bold claims, and I do this in one way or another every time I talk about Scottsboro. The first one is that in the long history of the U.S. civil rights movement, there has been no moment of more consequence than the Scottsboro Boys case. No moment of more consequence. The second one is, given how consequential this case was, it is the most understudied important moment in American history. And there are several reasons for this, and one has to do with the communist element in this case. The number one thing people who visit our museum in Scottsboro talk about or say, the number one thing I hear anyway, is like, why don't I know this? Why didn't I learn this growing up? Why is this not in textbooks? And the second most is people who come in and lawyers who, oh yeah, we studied this in law school. And some of them even remembered that it something about the facts of the case, but even in that situation, they don't know how this was such a watershed moment. And also, before I go on, I want you to note that I will use the imperfect moniker boys, as in Scottsboro Boys, to refer the defendants who were aged 13 to 20 at the time of their arrest. As all of you are aware, the practice of demeaning a black man of any age by calling him boy was widely used throughout America, not just in the South, but all through America at this time. At the time, however, when referring to the Scottsboro Boys, the word had a different meaning. So when it appeared in newspapers, it had a different meaning. It came from a sympathizing Northern African-American, international, or communist-backed press. So it's really these Northern presses that were saying that these are just boys, okay? These are the Scottsboro Boys. They're innocent. They're sexually innocent. They can't do this. They wouldn't have done this crime. It makes no sense. Look how you're treating them. When those trials ended, they were sentenced to die by execution. Eight of them were sentenced to die by execution on July 10th. So, enter the communists. All right, so your world history, if you remember your world history, there was the Russian Revolution in 1917. I work in like in 3 different decades, and I may say 19 or 20 at any moment. 2 years later, Communist Party USA was formed. If you remember the movie Reds and Warren Beatty, that's that era. In the 20s, Communist Party USA, or CP USA, operated mainly in northern urban areas, recruiting and organizing labor, working along leftist or left-leaning union organizers. It was all kind of a hodgepodge of ideologies, but it sort of had it as a target to get more capital down to the masses. And some of this I look at, like today, a couple of years ago, there was a Black Lives Matter rally downtown, and there were a lot of people that showed up. You know, I don't know if you can be a member of Black Lives Matter or if you're, you know, so it's hard when we talk about a communist at this time. Are we talking about a card-carrying member? Are we talking about a sympathizer, someone or somewhere in between somehow? So the lines get pretty blurred. But the result of operating mostly in the North and operating mostly in these industries that hadn't yet fully integrated in the North, this is when at the same time, many African Americans are migrating north to industrial centers like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. But the result of it was that what communist membership was there was almost entirely white. Moscow looked at that and said, no, this isn't, you know, this isn't working. So they funded some research, and they paid for a report on the situation. And then in 1928, at the biennial Congress that they have, Moscow, at the Moscow or Stalin, or whoever, the Communist International, a common term, stated that, or described blacks in the South as a subjugated people. And because they were a subjugated people, we are going to go in there, go into the South, we're going to set up offices, and we're going to recruit, and we're going to train, and we're going to try to win them over to the cause of, you know, this workers' paradise. So, in 1930, let me get my notes here, I'm sorry. In 1930, CPUSA established Birmingham, Alabama as a headquarters for a 5-state area: Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Florida. So all the activity, that was a field office. So everything would come out of Birmingham in the South, in the deep South. And the reason they picked Birmingham, it should be obvious. It was really the only industrial city in the South. Okay, Birmingham was created after the Civil War. It wasn't. It didn't have this plantocracy that you see in the rest of Alabama, and they had huge industrial concerns there. But the other thing is, outside of Birmingham, you had abundant sharecroppers who also could be turned over to this idea of a better way of life through Soviet-style communism, because that's what they're talking about still here. That does change. That's what they're talking about, though. In that same year, 1930, a gentleman named Saul Auerbach, who was in Cincinnati, had to leave town, and he was a communist, but he was also a publisher and a writer. He went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and changed his name to James Allen. And this is significant to the story because when the arrests happened, word of the Fort Chattanooga teenagers gets to James Allen, gets to the Southern Worker, which was his paper. He sends a reporter to cover the case, all right? Nobody's really covering the case other than the Huntsville paper, the Scottsboro. It's a very much a local / regional story. This is just, it's a bad thing that happened in Scottsboro. They're going to deal with it, get it over with. But the Southern Worker, this communist-backed paper, goes, and they write dispatches each day of the trial, and they also, not just what's going on in the trial, but also they're interviewing and talking to people in Scottsboro. And this is really the impetus of for how word starts getting out about the case. We really can't overstate how important this initial reporting of the daily work out of Chattanooga is, because they wrote a story, the Daily Worker, which had a huge circulation, picked it up, people read that, then the African American newspapers picked it up, and then it was mainstream, so that by August 25th, in Harlem, a little over 2 weeks after the sentencing police were called to break up a Scottsboro rally of several hundred, badly beating 5 and arresting 4 others. 1 month later, over 5,000 marched down Harlem's Lenox Avenue to protest. These protesters were holding signs saying, "They shall not die," or "Free the Scottsboro Boys." And this was all organized by the Communist Party. By July of that year, same year, and again, folks, this is before internet, this is before cable news or anything. This is just, this is just a story spreading like wildfire. The rest of the world had joined in by July. Even though the executions had been stayed pending appeal, demonstrations and letter writing pressure continued. Over 50,000 protesters marched in Munich, with several smashing rocks through the windows of the U.S. Embassy, carrying messages to free the Scottsboro Boys. A similar incident occurred in Beirut at the American Embassy there, in Edinburgh, Johannesburg, Havana, Mexico City, and lots of other places. There were rallies, planned rallies, and letter writing campaigns, and most of these letters went to the governor of Alabama. Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann were just two of the many well-known figures to plead with Alabama Governor Benjamin Miller. Their letter states, "Hundreds of representatives of intellectual Berlin beg you in the last hour, for the sake of humanity, to stop the sentence of the 8 young Negroes." While communists use their global network of like-minded leftist radicals to activate worldwide protest. While communists use their global network of like-minded leftist activists to activate worldwide protests, the International Labor Defense, or ILD, which was the legal arm of Comintern, had taken over representation of the defendants. The U.S. Supreme Court published its decision to overturn the lower court's verdict in November 1932 on the grounds that there had not been adequate time to prepare a defense for the capital case. I think so, 3 hours. The state immediately re-indicted and scheduled new trials, this time in Morgan County, to begin in March, end of March 1933, Judge James E. Horton presiding. You might ask at this moment, where was the NAACP in all this? To begin, the NAACP had traditionally stayed away from these types of cases, especially in the South, where a white woman accused a black man of rape. In the view of most of the association's leaders, these cases were unwinnable in Southern courtrooms and would require a tremendous outlay of resources, both in talent and cash, for the New York-based group. However, when its membership screamed loud enough, the NAACP pressed forward, and for a time, it looked like it would take the lead. They even secured Clarence Darrow, the most famous lawyer in the land, to be the lead defense attorney. But in the end, the families of the defendants felt more comfortable staying with the lawyers who had just won a victory at the Supreme Court level. In January 1933, I think I'm gonna flip here. In January 1933, the ILD hired New York superstar lawyer Samuel Leibowitz, notorious in some circles for representing the city's most colorful crime figures and winning each time. Leibowitz, nonetheless, was a conscientious man who, as a Romanian Jewish immigrant, believed everyone deserved a fair shake and that laws should be applied equally. When he first read the trial transcripts, he was aghast at the blunders made by the defense lawyers. His only reservation was working with the ILD, working with the Communist Party in any way. He was not a communist or a communist sympathizer. So he ended up taking the case, but refused any direct payment from the ILD. The first trial of 4 trials in Decatur is the most well-known of all of them, and for good reason. It was the subject of 2 movies. It's a wonderful documentary by American Experience, although it's not the total thing with American Experience. It's a large part of it. And a Broadway musical that was nominated for 11 Tonys. And the reason for that is, you may know, or I will tell you, is it was highly publicized, whereas the first trial, nobody was there other than this little group of communists come in and write stories. This one, all the major outlets are there, okay? So you have more coverage, you have more, the National Guardsmen are at the courthouse right away. There's this anticipation of violence, which I think always attracts people. I don't know what it says about us, but I think that was part of it too. And you have these figures, you had these great rivalries and tensions. Thomas Knight was this rising star in Alabama politics. He was the Attorney General at the time. He was young, I think he was 36 when he tried this first case. Leibowitz, I told you about. James Horton had an impeccable judicial record. He had born in Alabama. He was highly educated. He went to a year in med school before he decided that he would go into law. This was his 3rd term that he was serving as the 5th Circuit judge. And then you had all the drama with that one of the defendants was missing. We'll tell you what happened there. But was she going to show up? Could they find her in time for the trial? No one knew where Ruby Bates was. Her mother claimed she didn't know. Nobody knew where she was. So they have the trial. And it's one of those things where if this was on television and we're watching it, and we're 1935, so you got to do a lot of imagination here. If you live in the North, you would think Sam Leibowitz just mopped the floor with Victoria Price. He just twisted her all around, made her look silly. But if you were in the South, especially if you were somebody on that jury, all you saw was this Northerner disrespecting a Southern woman, and that at the end mattered more. So toward the end of the trial, Leibowitz famously says to Horton, "Oh wait, we have one more witness to call," and door opens in here. Clicking of heels, and in walks Ruby Bates. But now as a witness for the defense. So she went on the stand, told her story. We made it all up. Victoria said, if we don't do this, we're gonna have to go to jail. So, case closed, right? That should be it. That should be the final thing. It had no bearing on the case. They still convicted, and this is the case with Haywood, Patterson. And all the defense or all the prosecution had to do was go up there and say, Ruby, that's a lovely hat you have on. Where'd you get that, Ruby? Where'd you get those nice shoes? I don't know where they sell a dress like that down here in Alabama. It's all they had to do to put doubt in the jury's mind that she had been bought off by the communists. So Leibowitz thought he was outfoxing Thomas Knight, but it didn't work. And it was a fundamental issue with Samuel Leibowitz as the attorney. He didn't understand the South. He understood the law. He didn't understand Jim Crow. That was a problem. After another guilty verdict, the most startling thing happens. On June 23rd, 1933, Judge Horton sets aside the verdict. It's never happened. I haven't found another case where this has happened that before then, where a judge sets aside a jury verdict in a case involving a black man and a white woman. And his reasons were that the law is based on evidence and corroboration. And there's no corroboration to her story, and the evidence points toward the fact that she had not been raped. So what that meant was retrial. Didn't mean Haywood was free or anything. They went back to Kilby, and this time Judge William Callahan was assigned as the head judge. Now there couldn't be two more, and this is not Callahan here. This is Clarence Watts. I should put him with Leibowitz here, but Horton and Judge Callahan were polar opposites. Horton, highly educated. Callahan, more of a grew up in a good old boy network. Did not study law. He read the law. He got his law license that way. But probably the biggest difference is that when Horton talks about this, when Horton saw a case like this where a white woman accuses a black man, he tended to be suspicious of the woman. Whereas Callahan, when he saw this, tended to absolutely believe the woman, because why would she make this up? Because it's in his mind. He was so racist, you see. He was just so racist. He goes, God, it must be the most horrible thing for, a white woman would never make something like this up. So he was called Speedy Callahan because all he cared about was getting these trials over with and getting Scottsboro and Alabama off the front pages. That's all that he cared about. So they were once again tried, convicted, and then the appeals process started. And in the end, I think it's, as I mentioned, Leibowitz's naivete about Southern courts cost dearly, but he was a liability also because of his, because he was Jewish, he was from New York, and these were things that were used against him by local people, just saying that they just didn't trust him. And we know a lot more about this because before this trial, a lawyer working for the ILD came to Alabama from New York and pretended to be a soap salesman. And he went door to door, and he went to different, he went to a gas service station and places where people meet, but also just went around imposing as a soap salesman, asking, and he would bring up, so what about those Scottsboro Boys or whatever? And he was taking down their notes. So he came back brought it to the ILD. They wrote, they wrote the judge and said that we can't have a trial in this county because literally everybody is against is against that. But it didn't work. It didn't work. But we do know that because of them. The same year, in 1935, so moving ahead a little bit, the ILD came to grips with the fact that they may be hurting the case more than they're helping it. And at the same time, by 1935, the Communist Party was much more interested in what was happening in Nazi Germany and Italy, fascist Italy and Spain. So a lot of the resources that would have flown into this thing were now going in different places. But that same year, the Supreme Court ruled again in the Decatur trials that the 14th Amendment right to a trial by a jury of one's peers had been violated because there were no blacks that had ever served on the Jackson County or the Bergen County juries. So the state could have let it go at that point. I think the state could have said, you know what? We've spent all this money, we've spent all this time. What is the point? We're just going to go to the Supreme Court and we have to redo it all again. You would think that'd be a rational decision. But this is the Jim Crow South, and that's a bridge too far. That's saying that we're just going to let this happen. We're not going to protect our sacred women. We're going to just let this. So they re-indicted. So they had to go through the whole trial process again, and they would do that the next year. Haywood Patterson was tried and this time sentenced to 75 years in prison. By this time, also, I need to mention this because when the ILD and Leibowitz, they realized, okay, the communism thing is not playing real good down here. The Jewish thing's not playing real good down here. Let's get a southerner. Let's get somebody who's respected and whatever. So they found in Huntsville the ideal person in Clarence Watts. So Leibowitz technically ran the defense from New York City, but Leibowitz was involved in many cases in 1936 and 1937. Clarence Watts was the lead attorney here, and he was able to get up in front of the jurors and say, hey, I'm your neighbor, I'm your friend, I wouldn't lie to you, but I wouldn't have taken this case if I didn't know that these 9 were innocent. In 1937, the state of Alabama agreed on a compromise where 5 of the 9 defendants would be released, would have their charges null prossed or dropped. So, and they tended to be the young. It was Eugene Williams, Roy Wright, Billy Robertson, Olin Montgomery. Those 4 got out of prison right away. And what happened to them is they went to, and you talk about, they left the jail, got on a train to New York, where they were used to raise funds. So they performed at some of the large churches there around New York City, and they also made an appearance at the Apollo. And before that, they had someone thought it was a good idea that they would learn how to tap dance. So they went from one form of exploitation to another. By the way, Bill Bojangles Robinson was the tap dance instructor, so he taught him. And Mr. Robinson went on to pay for Roy Wright's education after that, before he went into the Army. So four defendants were freed. The fifth defendant, Ozzie Powell, had his charges dropped as well, but he had to stay in prison because he had assaulted a guard on the way back to prison in 1936. Clarence Norris was paroled in 1946 and fled the state. The FBI spent years trying to track him down. Norris ended up married, living in New York City with his wife and two daughters. In 1976, Governor George Wallace pardoned him, making him the only Scottsboro defendant pardoned in his lifetime. Charlie Weems was released in 1943. Haywood Patterson escaped to Michigan in 1948. Andy Wright from Chattanooga, was the last Scottsboro boy set free, and that was in 1950. Collectively, they spent 102 years in prison. Weems, Patterson, and Wright were posthumously pardoned by the state of Alabama in 2013. And because Norris had already been pardoned, that's 4 pardons. The other 5 had their charges dropped. They weren't eligible for a pardon, but they did get an official exoneration from the legislature. So, what is the legacy of this case, and why did I make such an outlandish statement that this was the most important thing in history at the beginning? Well, here are just a few things to consider. During the 1930s, the NAACP recruited thousands off the Scottsboro case, thousands of volunteers, and opened offices across the South. Many of these offices were affiliated with a new student-oriented NAACP. Among those who got involved was a young, recently married woman in Montgomery named Rosa Parks. She and her husband Raymond held clandestine meetings to raise funds to support the defense team. Thurgood Marshall was a law student when the Scottsboro case started, but witnessed how federal court systems could have a profound impact on a recalcitrant Southern courtroom. Marshall went on to win cases in the South using an appellate strategy, using a similar appellate strategy that the Scottsboro lawyers often used. By the end of the 30s, the NAACP had already started moderating its more conservative approach, and began to see value in mass protest and public pressure campaigns. While setting precedents in the courts remained the primary focus, the association now entertained more aggressive, organized demonstrations. Over the decades, dozens of cases involving a black man being falsely accused of raping a white woman became known as Little Scottsboroughs. In Martinsville, Virginia, Groveland, Florida, Laurel, Mississippi, and Central Park, New York City, the echoes of Scottsboro rang loud and clear, and the parallels were unavoidable. After the Scottsboro trial, the jury of trial after Scottsboro, after Scottsboro, trial by a jury of one's peers and the right to competent counsel were applied, if imperfectly at first, to criminal cases across the South. And if they weren't, they were appealed. As a Richmond newspaper editor wrote in 1933, failure to call Negroes for jury service in the South will produce more and more complications as time goes on. The second trial of the Scottsboro case probably has marked an epoch, E-P-O-C-H, in this respect. The Communist Party learned a tough lesson in Scottsboro. What they learned is that there was no bypassing Jim Crow. In 1928 and 1930, Moscow didn't understand that even if you could create a favorable sentiment toward communism among Southern blacks, Jim Crow would not allow African Americans to vote in numbers that would meaningfully make a difference. By 1935, the party better understood that, what they were up against, but by that time, as I said before, the focus was Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. From Scottsboro forward, the American civil rights movement has fought to disassociate itself publicly from the Communist Party. This taint continues today with perhaps the word socialism replacing communism. Sadly, Scottsboro showed that black teens could be expendable in ways our country has never dreamed of with white youngsters. As incarceration rates show today, the tendency to lock up people of color at higher rates than white citizens is, if anything, greater than it was in 1931. I would like to end this by showing a 1-minute video of the Scottsboro Boys Museum. Some of you have been there, but many of you haven't. And then we'll be happy to entertain any of your questions. Well, in that case, we will take questions. Yes.
You said one of the young men fled to Michigan.
Right.
Was he, that sounds like he escaped out of jail, did he?
He did. He was
did?
at a prison farm. He ran away, made his way up to Michigan. It was Hayward Patterson. And what's interesting about this is that he, Alabama tried to get him extradited back to Alabama from Michigan. And when they tried to do that, the Michigan governor appeared with Hayward at a press conference and said he's not going back down there. Because he knew it was a death sentence for Hayward if he went back. So, there's a whole book about that, by the way, because at that time, can you hear me okay back there, or do I need them?
At that time, there was this huge migration of African-American workers coming up. I mean, it's been going on for 20-some years, so Haywood, it meant two things. Haywood had family in the Detroit area who were working in the automobile industry or some other associated industry. But also meant politically for the governor, it would look really bad to send Hayward Patterson back to Alabama. And that's a cynical view. The other, he also could have really wanted just to protect him too.
But was he exonerated or pardoned?
He got a posthumous pardon. Yeah. He was the one that he had to stay after that compromise in 1937.
Does the museum have regular hours to go in, or you have to make an appointment to go in? Or what?
So we're open, great question. We're open Wednesday through Saturday from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And then on Fridays, we've been staying open or on Saturdays, we've been staying open until 4 o'clock. So during those times. If you have a tour or a larger group, we can make arrangements to be there on other days.
How did you get involved?
Okay, so I got involved with this, I was finishing my dissertation at the University of Alabama, not on this subject. It was on professionals in the antebellum Alabama. And I saw an email that there's this new museum starting in Scottsboro, and they needed someone to go up there and write a local history of the area for this grant that the university was they were trying to support the museum. So that's how I got involved. So I went up there and I met Sheila Washington the first day. She met me there. Then I started reading. I did what people do every day there. It's like, how do I not know this? How am I so into this whole story? Because it's, this is just tiny bit of this story that we talked about tonight. So, and then I think Kevin alluded to, I got involved with the passing of legislation, doing that. And then by that time I was all in. And so I was the board historian, and unfortunately, in 2021, January 2021, Sheila passed away, and we were down for a whole year after that. We were also redoing the museum, and so everything in COVID was going on, so we had all this stuff happening at once. So, long story short, I went from being the museum's historian to the executive director during that period. And one of our board members is over here, Miss Juanita Lee, over here.
Thank you all for coming out.
Yeah. Yes.
Hey, Tom. I enjoyed your presentation, but I know you called it Red Alabama because of communism. And you talked about Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
Can you define, I think most people know what it is, would you define what Jim Crow is?
Yeah, when I talk about Jim Crow, that's a good question. And I didn't do it, and it showed you're paying attention too, because I was trying to cut things down, so I'm not going to go into a huge thing about Jim Crow. But Jim Crow was both, in the South, both a legal institution and a cultural adaptation, I would say, from black codes from the Civil War era. And basically it meant a segregated society. Jim Crow laws existed to maintain that, and when you say it's segregating a society, that's only a half-truth, because it wasn't just splitting the society, it was elevating whites over blacks in the process of splitting it. And it's why the Brown v. Board was so important, because Plessy segregated cars officially, railroad cars, saying they had to be separate but equal, but they were never equal. Separate and equal doesn't work. So Jim Crow was, a system that elevated and maintained white supremacy through segregation. And the foundation of Jim Crow really gets to this case, because the greatest fear is among white supremacists, and I would probably say even today, I don't know, I don't research the probablys or anything, but I bet this is miscegenation, is blacks and white people of color, people and whites procreating, because it would, that'll soil the blood, or whatever, and Jim Crow was so effective in the American South that it was studied, and I know you know this, it was studied intently by Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler had these crazy anti-Semitic views for a long time, like before he wrote Mein Kampf. He didn't know how to pull it off until he started studying the South. That's how you do it. You take this away, and then you take this away, and you take this away. So,
So I have two separate things.
okay.
One, in the museum, there was a correlation between Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird and ideas, where she might have gotten ideas from
Right.
this case. And I think it's very relevant since the Broadway Theater League
I know.
is bringing the play.
Awesome.
And so, could you tell us some of those, what you think Harper Lee gleaned from this case that was put in the book To Kill a
Right.
Mockingbird?
So, I found one interview where she actually talked about it. She was asked about it a lot, but she didn't really answer. Remember that she was born in 1926, so when they were first arrested, she was 5. But she would have grown up hearing about it, right? For the next 7 or 8 years, it's in the headlines, every day. So she would, she adored her daddy, and she would have listened to him talking about it, probably complaining about it. In most Alabamans, by the way, complaining about that case because it was costing them a fortune, and this is during the Depression, right? What she said in an interview in a New Zealand magazine was that while this case, the Scottsboro case, could serve as her example or whatever, it was much grander than anything she had in mind. But that said, she didn't say it had nothing to do with it either. But it wasn't like I'm gonna think about Scottsboro. Interestingly enough,
May I interject?
Yeah.
It seems like there's a correlation between Judge Horton and Atticus
Yeah,
Finch.
absolutely.
A little bit, if it does to me.
No, I think there is too. So we in the museum interpret it this way, that Atticus Finch would be an amalgamation of Judge Horton, Samuel Leibowitz, and of Matt Wan. Because there's a scene in The Kill Mockingbird where Atticus Finch is on the porch of the jail, and the mob comes up and he stops them. That was very much like Sheriff Wan, right? And then Leibowitz, his arguments in court, and he was the defense lawyer. But then Horton, Horton has this, he rises above it all. He's the, if you're familiar with, my wife's gonna hate when I tell this, but I know you guys, but the allegory of the caves, Plato's allegory of the caves, right? If you're not familiar, it's Plato, he's writing Socrates' voice. He says, imagine a cave, and outside the cave is a big fire. Inside the cave are a group of people who are chained looking at a wall. And they've been there their whole life. They don't know anything other than the shadows on the wall as people walk in front of the fire. What happens when one of those people gets out of the chain, walks outside, and sees, instead of seeing a shadow of a horse, they see a horse. Instead of seeing the shadow of a cart, they see the actual cart. What happened? And so the person goes and does it, and they're all excited. They're going to go back and tell their friends who are chained looking at shadows. They're like, oh, there's so much more to life. There's all this and that. But what happens is first of all, they don't believe him. They ostracize him. They tell him he's crazy. And this is what happens to Horton. He's the one that gets off the chains, gets out the cave, tries to come back and tell people. And what do? They never vote for him for public office again. That's how they repaid him. He did okay though. After that. Was that your other?
And it was,
Okay.
that's where I was going.
Okay.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. Joe.
Just to understand a couple of things that you said. One, you said, you talked about sexual
innocence.
Innocence.
Right.
I noticed in the museum, the mannequin of Ruby,
Mannequins of Victoria.
Victoria.
Yeah.
She's dressed, were they not prostitutes? I've read books that was prostitutes.
Right. So the boys part, there's two things I want to answer, both of them. The idea of calling them boys was not in the way that, a demeaning way. It was people from the north saying, hey, these are just kids. In fact, Roy Reidy, Roy, who was 14 at the time of the arrest, told the New York Times reporter that he didn't know what the word rape meant when it was first brought up to him. So it's that idea. Were they prostitutes? Victoria had been arrested 4 months earlier for adultery. She had been married twice. We know they were workers. We know they weren't making much money. We know that Victoria's mother was a fairly notorious prostitute in Huntsville. We also know that it was tough. I mean, in 1931, you're working in a mill and you're not making much anyway. Your hours get cut, your pay gets cut, and what options? There's not a lot of options for women at this time. It's a difficult question for me to answer because, if you were going to place a wager, probably. But neither were ever arrested for soliciting. But that doesn't mean that they weren't arresting people for soliciting either. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but they weren't on the train to solicit sex. There was no money on that train. Chattanooga would have been a better place, even than Huntsville, to solicit sex. Its economy was doing a little bit better during the Depression.
Tell them about Sheriff Juan in the end, what happened to him.
Oh, Sheriff Juan, who is the Atticus, one of our Atticus Finch people, right? Finch peoples who stands on the door and says, "I'm going to blow your head off if you come by." He got a lot of backlash from the community for allegedly being supportive or not letting the mob get him. Because it would not have been uncommon to go into a jail, take prisoners out, and lynch them, right? 1 year later, almost to the date, it was about a few weeks after, Sheriff Juan gets a phone call with a tip that this guy he's been chasing, this bootlegger, is at this house and will be there around 9 o'clock in the evening.